All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this online webinar, all centered around the gut and autoimmunity and the connection that's had within it. And this, for me, is all born out of the idea that if you can regain trust in your gut health, you can regain trust in your body enough to heal and get over the autoimmunity. And this, for some of you, this may be a new approach that maybe seem unconventional to work on your gut health to attack your autoimmunity, but it's an approach that I've seen work well many times over, myself included, which we will dive into more in a little bit. And I hope you all enjoy. All right, so this is Tom. You can all say, hi, Tom, in your heads. And Tom, he was your run-of-the-mill, average, hardworking American man who wanted to provide for his family and do a job he loved. And he used to be someone that was calm, happy. He was very fulfilled in the career that he had. He actually owned his own business, and he was in very good health. Unfortunately, Tom became diagnosed with thyroid autoimmunity. And he was now very anxious. As a matter of fact, so anxious that he would go on family vacations with his children and then would have to turn around halfway on the drive there because he just had too much anxiety and couldn't handle the drive. He was also depressed because of the whirlwind of anxiety. He was starting to become a little overweight and developing some metabolic dysfunction. This really hit Tom hard, is that he was forced to sell his landscaping business that he'd owned for decades. And on top of all that, he eventually became divorced. And Tom was in a pretty rough place. One of these on their own can be incredibly challenging to overcome, but when you combine all of these plus the thyroid autoimmunity, it was just a perfect storm for a very challenging part in Tom's life. And I highlight this point to you all to kind of show you that, unfortunately, maybe some of you may be going through all of these things, or maybe just one of them. And autoimmunity can contribute and sort of make it seem as if life is stacked up against you. What we're going to talk about is how you can take those stacks and build them up to build a life that you want and the life that you deserve. Autoimmune diseases, from a traditional medical perspective, have no cure. There's no known pharmaceutical or surgery that can cure any autoimmune disease. But that doesn't mean that a lot of these autoimmune diseases have similar underlying root causes. In functional medicine, we are all about root cause approach. So that's discovering why the autoimmune disease started in the first place, because once we figure out why, we can reverse engineer, get back to the why, correct that, and hopefully try and improve how your body handles the autoimmunity. So I'm a big fan of pyramids. Not going to lie, never been to the pyramids, but they look really cool. And I think they make for a perfect analogy in the sense that the foundation of the pyramid is the reason that the pyramids are still standing, because the foundation is wider than the top and it provides enough structural integrity for them to withstand anything. And from an autoimmune perspective, there are lots of things at the foundation that could be driving this disease. Genetics is one of them. I'm not going to discount the fact that genetics don't play a role, but the environment in which you grew up in plays just as much, if not bigger role than genetics. The way I like to think of it is genetics load the gun, but your environment pulls the trigger. So you can have the worst genes, you could have parents that had autoimmune disease, but if you don't induce those bad genes to get turned on by things you do in your lifestyle and your environment, you may never get the disease. So genes are not the end-all be-all factor. You can still do things in your daily life to prevent the trigger from being pulled. The lifestyle you play in, the lifestyle you grew up in, how much you exercise, how stressed are you? Do you have a life purpose? Dietary factors, the one that comes off to mind is celiac disease, where when you eat gluten, you literally have an autoimmune response to some of the cells inside your gut. And celiac is a pretty intuitive one to say, oh, celiac gut. But gut health in general has a massive impact on your autoimmune conditions. And whenever anyone talks about gut health, I want you guys to start thinking about, well, what about gut health? Because it's very much a buzzword, but you want to look for specifics that people are referring to. What we're talking about here is the gut microbiome. As the slide says, the trillions, I love to emphasize this, trillions of bacteria, viruses, fungi, and hopefully not, but sometimes parasites. And they've been living inside of us since humans have been in existence. They help us, we help them. So when everything's well, it's all kumbaya for the two of us. But sometimes if you have autoimmunity, your body's not singing kumbaya too well to you. And part of that could be driven by some disruptions in your microbiome. So we talked about what determines how your autoimmune disease can be caused. What types of things influence the microbiome? Similar things. Diet is a big one. You know, every time you eat a meal, you're feeding your gut bugs. So depending on the composition of that meal, fruits, vegetables, fiber, protein, types of fats, that's all going to feed different types of bugs. The exercise you do, strength training, walking, CrossFit, yoga, Pilates, you name it, the type of exercise that you do influences the microbiome. I read a fascinating study 2 weeks ago. I read a lot of things, and there are some things that stand out. And this study showed that people that were graded highest on neuroticism had the highest abundance of a certain kind of inflammatory bacteria. And what's even crazier is those people that scored highest on conscientiousness, so the ability to think about situations and think about others in a deeper meaning, had the lowest amount of this pro-inflammatory bacteria. So think about that. Literally the thoughts you have can not only be determined by the bacteria, but then subsequently your thoughts could actually change what type of bacteria you have. So I think that's another reinforcement for trying to have as many rational positive thoughts as you can. Because it's hard to be super positive all the time, but to be as rational about your positivity as possible. Rational Optimist, which is a great book, by the way. Stress levels. This one for most of us is probably pretty intuitive, that if you don't like what you do, if you don't sleep a heck of all that much, and you're stressed out all the time, probably not going to be beneficial for the microbiome. I love this one, the upbringing. So I know people that have grown up on farms around lots of pets, lots of different animals, outdoors a lot, lots of different environmental exposures, and their gut can handle just about anything now. It's basically, people always use the term iron gut because they have very little food reactions. And to me, I think a lot of that is driven by their microbiome being exposed to so many things growing up. So kind of trained it to adapt to whatever situation it's encountered with. And now we're going to touch on some of the research literature regarding the differences in the microbiome with people with autoimmunity. And this is just saying that in people, the one on the bottom right with Hashimoto's, they found that there's a different microbiome profile between people with Hashimoto's, people without. Not saying that that caused the Hashimoto's, but it's interesting to note that there is a difference there. There's a clear difference. And even in chronic fatigue syndrome, the term enteric dysbiosis just means in your gut, there's too many bad bugs and or not enough good bugs. That's what dysbiosis is. Dys meaning not good, biosis meaning life, enteric inside the gut. So chronic fatigue syndrome could at its core partially be driven by the type of bacteria and viruses you have. Skin conditions are a big one. So psoriasis, eczema can partially be driven by changes in the microbiome. People who have psoriasis have a microbiome that's over here. People who don't have a microbiome that's over here. So there's a difference there. And where do we create that overlap, and how did that overlap happen? More importantly, how do we get these people back to being healthy? And, you know, less psoriasis affecting their life. Hashimoto's, which is a big one. It's actually the most common autoimmune disease currently. And further evidence that people with Hashimoto's have a certain type of bacteria, people that don't. Have you ever noticed when you're on vacation, you feel a little different? Probably for the better. Maybe you don't have as many autoimmune flares. Maybe you're less stressed. You could eat foods that you otherwise normally couldn't handle. I hear this from people all the time. Whenever I go to Europe, I can handle the bread. Could be driven by the way they make the bread. I also think it's driven just because you're on vacation and you're less stressed. So when you're less stressed, your immune system isn't on high alert as much. And so it's less likely to induce food reactions or food sensitivities. Also, again, never been to the pyramids, but I imagine this is what it looks like, where you're on camels with your whole family behind you, and the pyramids are in the background, and it's majestic, it's beautiful, and then everybody's having fun. And then maybe you can handle dairy here because it's from camels and you're on vacation. But unfortunately, for many people, once you return from this vacation, this is the mode it becomes. And then everything comes back. The flares become just as random as they were before vacation. You eat a food that you always do, and you get joint pain, you get skin issues, you get tired, and you're just kind of wondering, what the heck, what was it about vacation? What was it about here that made me not have flares? But when I come back into this state, why did it get so random again? So part of what people can try and work toward is, how do you create an environment like this more than just a couple weeks a year you're on vacation? Not saying that situations like this are never going to happen. I mean, it's life. We're human. These will happen. But how do we try and make it so you have maybe more of these in your life than you do have these? Another close-up of the pyramids here. And making alterations to your lifestyle, as we've kind of already touched on, can also alter your microbiome. Diet. You're going to see a recurring theme here, is that diet is at the foundation of so many things. Because think about, say you eat 3 meals a day and you live to be, the average life expectancy, I think, is in the low 80s for those of us in America. It's over 100,000 meals in your lifetime. That's a lot of opportunity to change your microbiome. Exercise, walking, strength training, cardio, long-term conditioning, swimming. I mean, again, you name it, it's going to have effects on your microbiome. The thoughts you have, again, which is, I wish people talked about this more, that it doesn't necessarily have to be positivity all the time, but having a reframing approach around stressful or challenging situations. Stress levels, I mean, that just kind of goes without saying. And when I say stress is unavoidable, but how can we make your body more resilient to stress? And part of that could be driven by changing the microbiome and things you're exposed to in the environment. So whether that's BPA, whether that's heavy metals, whether that's you moved somewhere and you're in a moldy home. I've worked with a lot of people who their symptoms are worse depending on a move they had. So their flares were less random, and then they moved to a new house. Their flares become very frequent, and they realize, oh wait, there's mold in here. And mold is a big immune system trigger, which can further lead to more autoimmune flares. But one thing as maybe less well known is the idea that gut health supplements can actually impact people with autoimmune disease. And I'm talking autoimmune disease that's seemingly unrelated to the gut. So people can see celiac or inflammatory bowel disease as, okay, those are gut symptoms. But psoriasis, rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, these things that are considered outside the gut, you can take gut-specific supplements and improve their outcomes. So here's a study that looked at symbiotics, and what symbiotics are. It's a combination of prebiotics, which feed good bacteria, and then the probiotic supplement itself. And this looked at people with Hashimoto's, so autoimmune thyroid. What they found was that, and this is important, They found that there was improvements in fatigue, so subjective measures, so how you feel. There was also improvements in TSH, or thyroid stimulating hormone levels, which is it's a marker that's used a lot to help in the diagnosis and treatment of hypothyroidism. And there was actually changes in how much thyroid hormone these people were taking. So think about that. You could potentially take less thyroid hormone, and if you have a more, let's say, helpful microbiome, you could absorb more of it and need less of it. I mean, that's just a win-win for everybody involved. And it's important when you read studies like this that not only do you see improvements in lab markers, but improvements in how the people feel. Because ultimately, I don't care if a lab marker gets better. If you don't feel better, I'm going after how you feel. And if the lab marker coincides with it, that's awesome. If not a big deal. We all may have heard vitamin D's implications for immunity and especially autoimmunity. And it's found that 3/4 of people with lupus had insufficient vitamin D levels. Now, the big question is, if it's insufficient, what happens when you bring those D levels up? So they looked at that with people with Hashimoto's, and they found that supplementation with vitamin D in vitamin D deficient people led to a significant decrease in antibody levels. And antibodies are it's a way to gauge the immune response, so how much autoimmunity is going on. This next one's one of my favorite studies. Again, symbiotics and probiotics for autoimmune diseases in general. And whenever you see systematic review and meta-analysis, that's kind of the gold standard in clinical studies and research. And the study focused on people with rheumatoid arthritis and lupus. And there was clinically and statistically significant reduction in inflammatory markers. This is huge. This highlights that probiotics could also be anti-inflammatory. So we know they can be beneficial for IBS, SIBO, constipation, diarrhea, gas, bloating, all the textbook gut symptoms. But now we can actually start to think, hey, probiotics could be anti-inflammatory and kind of modulate the immune response if you have autoimmune disease. So I think this is huge. This is an area that I'm definitely keen on headed forward. And now you're probably wondering, that all sounds fine and well, but those are all lab and very rigorous studies. Like, what actually happens in real life? Like, do you work with people on autoimmunity? Do you actually have people that have improved? Let's talk about that a little bit. So this is a girl named Mariah, and she was in her mid-20s. And right about the time the pandemic hit, she was diagnosed with Crohn's disease. Crohn's disease is a type of inflammatory bowel disease. And unfortunately for Mariah, at its worst, she was having 20 episodes of diarrhea a day. 20. You think that's going to affect your life if you have 20 bouts of diarrhea in a day? You have to basically know where every public restroom is within a 10 square mile radius. I mean, your life is dictated on, I like to call it toilet mapping, because you better have all the stars where all the restrooms are on your Google Maps. But fortunately for her, we stumbled on the right thing together. We did some elemental dieting, which is just an all liquid diet that can be extremely beneficial for people with very severe gut or autoimmune disease. In her case, she had both. And she was able to go on 4-hour hikes by herself with no digestive issues. Didn't need to use a restroom, no episodes of diarrhea. Not only was it a 4-hour hike, she had to drive an hour to get there, which typically driving 20 minutes anywhere would take 40 because you have to go to the bathroom a couple times. Drive an hour there, 4-hour hike there, and an hour back with nothing. And I remember getting the text from her that said, man, you ever just get so excited for people? I was thrilled because she's a very creative person. So she went there and she did hiking and she did some creative activities that filled her up. And to me, that's what it's all about, is how can we help people find activities that fill them up and that allow them to best help others. And then we had the woman named Mandy. And Mandy was an emergency room nurse, and she had rheumatoid arthritis, and she particularly had it really bad in her wrists. And she would wake up most mornings with incredibly swollen joints in her wrist. And if you can just think of the personality type of an ER nurse, kind of tough and edgy and hard-nosed. This is exactly what Mandy was. Someone who doesn't really do a lot for themselves and focuses on helping others at the expense of, self-care and self-love. But we finally got to a point with Mandy where it was starting to affect her work. So when she couldn't serve people as well as she normally could in the ER, she's like, hey, I need to get a handle on this. And so we did some paleo dieting with specific removal of foods based on how she was responding to stuff, because you can't just give random paleo and hope it works. You have to tweak it based on everybody's individual needs. And she would go, and we combined probiotics and other herbal anti-inflammatories. And then she would go weeks at a time without even noticing that her wrists were in pain. She would wake up with far less swelling, and she could get back to performing her job at the level that she wanted to. Again, that's what it's all about, is just helping people live the life they want, deserve, and especially if they've had it before, helping them get back to that level. There's me. This picture, you can definitely tell it's not a professional headshot or anything. This is a little bit longer hair of me. But I went through a journey of switching careers and went back to graduate school to do what I do now. And I started learning about the immune system and thyroid, overall health in general, and thought I was doing everything right, but was having lots of fatigue, lots of insomnia, was having lots of brain fog. And at the time I was doing CrossFit, intermittent fasting, demanding academics, graduate school, drinking coffee, and I was just stressed to the nine, everything. And I had some lab work done as I started to learn about it. And it turns out I had Hashimoto's. And then I started learning about the symptoms of Hashimoto's, and I'm going, okay, I have the lab data that matches up with my symptoms. It's probably what I have. And I went through a lot to try and figure out what it was. I did lots of different restrictive dietary protocols. I did lots of fasting. I even did one meal a day at times for a week. And I remember I would just get so bloated from having like 25 to 3,000 calories in one meal. Wouldn't recommend that if you haven't tried it. But eventually I did stumble upon a specific dietary pattern. It was paleo-esque, but I found some foods that worked really well for me. And I was able to, get back to a level. I have my Oura ring. I'm not wearing it right now because it's charging, but my Oura ring now says I have B average sleep scores. And during my flares of insomnia, I would get 2 to 3 hours of sleep a night. And in graduate school, sleeping 2 hours and trying to weight train, it was a lot to get through the day. But, thankfully I hit on the right thing, hit on the right supplements, improved my sleep scores. And, I had the ability to make this great presentation for you guys. And I'm so thankful for that journey, because that journey is what led me to where I am now. Back to the pyramids again. See, I hope by now, if maybe none of you have been to the pyramid, you're starting to say, hey, I kind of want to go vacation there and see what it looks like. There's also an Office episode where they're working for Sabre, and they're talking about embrace the pyramid of this new kind of iPad-like product. If you haven't seen The Office, you're probably like, I don't know what you just talked about, in which case just forget I said it. But if you know, you know. So the approach we use with patients here at our clinic is a model it's built from a pyramid, and it's built from the gut health foundations of diet and lifestyle, with supplements then layered on top, and then key here, and then lab testing as the cherry on top. All too often in functional medicine, this pyramid is reversed. And lab testing, thousands and thousands of dollars worth of lab testing is done up front, and you just create so much noise because everything either comes back normal or looks bad, then you don't know where to start. And if it all looks bad, the practitioner will give you thousands of dollars worth of supplements without even really addressing the fundamentals of diet, stress, movement, sleep, mindset. And these things are so much more impactful, and they're so much more sustainable. I never want people to be taking supplements long-term, because then, your body doesn't really feel like it's healing if it has to take all these different things every day. To me, that just kind of makes sense. And there is a place for gut health specific supplements, probiotics, herbal antimicrobials, immunoglobulins, turmeric, ginger, things of this nature. But it all should be built on top of the foundations of a paleo-like diet, elemental diet, low FODMAP, whatever is needed based on your symptoms and your history, on top of stress management tactics, exercise regime, mindset. Those are the foundations that make up a healthy gut and the healthy life, and also life purpose, which I wish people more talked about that more. It's also incredibly cost effective, because when you don't spend thousands of dollars on lab testing and supplements, I mean, you save money in the long run, and you can actually tell what's working and what's not if you just stagger the supplements, and as opposed to just giving all 20 at one time. I've seen some extensive protocols that people have been given. And there's also this idea in functional medicine that it's restrictive diets and it's just very rigid routines you have to follow all the time. And you don't have to do that at all. I will say the more extreme your condition or the longer you've been dealing with it, from a general rule, you probably have less leeway, but that doesn't mean you have no leeway. And so I always like to tell people, just try and aim for getting 1% better each and every day. And I stole this quote from James Clear's book, Atomic Habits. If you haven't read it, highly recommend it. And there's also this quote from Tony Robbins. So I'm not going to get all rah-rah like Tony Robbins does, but he says some really cool stuff. And that people underestimate what they can do in 10 years, but they overestimate what they can do in a year. And where I take that and what I do is that, if you've been dealing with autoimmune disease for years or decades at a time, and a couple months into a program, you're like, it's not working, I only feel a little better, nothing's happening. As long as you're trying to get 1% better every day, just understand that over the longer term, that's where it matters. It's, if you can take sort of that longer term approach to things, not saying people don't feel huge swings and improvements quickly. I mean, again, everyone is just so different that, sometimes people can feel extremely different in weeks, and sometimes it takes months. And that's where it takes an experienced practitioner who can give you a good idea based on your symptoms of how you're going to do it. So what you really need, like I just touched on, is a practitioner who's going to tailor the plan to your needs. That's not protocol based. It's, it could be built from a foundation, core pillars, diet, lifestyle, then supplements, but they individualize it and tailor it to you. And we have had the pleasure of working with lots of different kinds of people. And this one woman who was also having lots of digestive issues, and we had her try an elemental diet, similar to Mariah, who was having 20 bowel movements a day, and she did extremely well on it. And this woman had some different challenges going through the elemental diet, but we worked with her. We tried to find ways to say, hey, it sounds like an electrolyte issue, or maybe you need to up your salt intake a little bit. And she also said she didn't feel like working out. And as someone who came to this health sphere because of fitness, I always empathize very, very hard with that. So then I just said, look, why don't you try adding in some lean meats that are very easily to digest? And that makes for a great conduit to make salt more palatable. So again, some people may have been given a protocol to do an elemental diet and just been told, good luck, we'll see you in a week, see how it goes. But when you get real-time coaching and real-time feedback from your clinician, that's just such a powerful combo, because then they can tweak it even more to your unique needs. And for those of you who signed up, if I have a free guide called 5 Tips for Living with Autoimmunity. It covers a lot of the stuff we talked about here. It's less supplement heavy and more so just on diet and lifestyle pillars that you can use. And it's written out for those of you who like more formal written information. But there's also the opportunity to work with me one-on-one if you feel as though you want to see if our foundational pyramidal approach is right for you. And you can start that by scheduling a complimentary consultative call. And what this is, it's a free 15-minute phone conversation where we go over your health goals, your top questions, and all to determine if you think we're going to be a right fit for you. And a lot of autoimmunity can seem really daunting, especially if you've been dealing with it for a while. There's so many, they say heavy metals, mold, mycotoxins, nutrients, gluten, dairy, all this. It becomes very overwhelming. So part of what this call is meant to do is to help guide you on the right next steps. There's a lot of next steps, but how do we figure out which one is right for you? And that's what we try to figure out in this call. So I see patients virtually across the country. I have patients from Virginia, Tennessee, Missouri, and then I also see people in person in the greater Phoenix area. And some of you may like closure, and you know you like closure when every time your Netflix episode ends, you have to say, oh no, we got to watch more of it. And here's a hack. If you watch the first 10 to 15 minutes of the next episode and then stop it, then you'll be less likely to fall prey to the, binge watching 5 hours, unless that's your goal, in which case, be my guest. But here's some closure on Tom. Some of you might be wondering, hey, you touched on Tom in the beginning, but what the heck happened to him? What's going on with him now? So I want you to just, by looking at that picture, what do you think is happened? And full transparency, this is my father. He was actually my first patient, if you will, that I got to work with autoimmune disease. And we did some really simple stuff. Because he's had your traditional standard American diet kind of his whole life. So we just did some gluten-free dieting because there's some evidence to show that gluten can worsen autoimmune symptoms in those that with autoimmune thyroid, and that's what he had. And then we just did some adaptogenic herbs, especially around, getting divorced, selling his business. There was just a lot of stress going on in his life. So we gave his stress system some support for that. And look what happened. And he ended up finding a girlfriend that he's been with for over 10 years now. She's essentially my stepmom, and she's great. He's back at a job he loves, actually working for his childhood best friend now. He's killing it. And he enjoys traveling again. And he hasn't had to turn around halfway through a trip just because he's anxious. And he's actually hopefully he's going to be flying out here in a couple months to come visit me in Phoenix. So this just, man, if you can get your life back by improving your autoimmune disease. You can get back to doing the things you love. And to me, that's what it's all about, is like, how can we help you create a life to get you back on your life purpose, back to doing the things you love? And that could mean anything to anybody, but I hope you guys did enjoy this. And if you want to learn more about our approach and to schedule that consultative call, you can go to the website listed at the bottom right, www.hivenaturalhealth.com, and you can learn more about us there. All right. Thanks, everyone.